Emily Carter stood by the window of her small Toronto apartment as the evening rushed past her like it had somewhere else to be, cars humming below, lights blinking on and off, the city alive while she felt strangely paused, caught in a moment she could never fully explain, because the secret she carried had started years ago and still followed her like a shadow, and on this night, as rain tapped softly against the glass, she felt closer than ever to letting it slip, to telling someone, anyone. But the memory pulled her back to where it all began, to an autumn afternoon in Vermont when she was 24 and visiting her father, Daniel Carter, a man she had always known as calm, dependable, and steady, the kind of man who fixed broken chairs and paid bills on time and never raised his voice, a man who seemed made of certainty, until that day when he asked her to go for a drive, his voice polite but tight, as if holding something fragile inside, and Emily noticed it right away because children, even grown ones, can sense when something is wrong with their parents, they can feel it in the air, in the pauses between words, and as she grabbed her jacket and followed him to the car, she wondered if he was sick, or lonely, or simply tired of being strong, but she never guessed what was coming, and the drive itself felt longer than it should have, the road winding through trees dressed in orange and gold, leaves falling like quiet thoughts, the radio silent because Daniel didn't turn it on, his hands firm on the wheel, his eyes focused ahead, and Emily watched him from the corner of her eye, noticing how older he looked in that light, how the years sat gently but firmly on his face, and she realized she had never truly asked him about his life before her, not about who he was before he became dad, and when he finally pulled over near a small lake, the water so still it reflected the sky perfectly, Emily felt a tightness in her chest, because places like that seemed chosen for important moments, and they stayed in the car, windows down, cold air brushing their faces, and Daniel took a deep breath that sounded like he had been holding it for years, and he said, slowly, "There's something I should have told you a long time ago," and Emily's heart began to race, her mind jumping from one fear to another, but she stayed quiet, because she had learned that silence sometimes made room for truth, and Daniel stared at the lake instead of her, as if the water might understand him better. And he spoke about his youth, about a time before responsibility weighed so heavily, about dreams that felt simple then, and Emily listened, surprised by how unfamiliar his voice sounded when he spoke that way, softer, more unsure, and he told her about a woman named Sarah Mitchell, a name that seemed ordinary but carried something heavy in the way he said it, a woman he had loved deeply when he was young, a woman who knew him before life shaped him into the man Emily knew, and as he spoke, Emily felt something shift inside her, because parents are often seen as complete stories, finished and settled, but here was her father, revealing an unfinished chapter, and Daniel explained how life pulled them in different directions, how choices were made not out of lack of love but out of fear and timing, how Sarah moved west, chasing opportunities, while he stayed, believing stability mattered more than longing, and the words came faster now, as if once started, they couldn't be stopped. And Emily realized he had carried this alone for decades, and when he paused, his hands trembling slightly, he told her that Sarah had reached out recently, just a message, simple and polite, asking how he was, and Emily felt her breath catch, because the past was no longer safely buried, it was knocking, and Daniel admitted he hadn't answered, that he didn't know if he should, that he felt loyalty to the life he had built but confusion about the feelings that never fully left. And Emily looked at him then, really looked, and saw not just her father but a man afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of hurting people he loved, and she felt an unexpected ache, because she understood that feeling more than she wanted to admit, and as the silence returned, heavier but honest, Emily knew this moment would stay with her forever, because something fragile had been placed in her care, a truth not meant to be shared casually, and as they drove back home without speaking much, the sky darkening and the road glowing under the headlights, Emily felt older. Somehow, as if she had stepped into a deeper understanding of love and regret and time, and now, years later, standing alone in her apartment, she pressed her forehead to the cool glass and closed her eyes, knowing that this secret, born beside a quiet lake and sealed with trust, was the reason she hesitated to speak, the reason she feared unfinished love. And the reason part one of her story would always begin with a drive that changed how she saw her father, and herself, forever. Daniel Carter did not plan to tell the story all at once, but once he began that evening by the lake, the words moved fast, as if they had waited too long for air, and he spoke about his younger self with honesty Emily had never heard before, a version of him that existed long before responsibility shaped his days, when he was just Daniel, not a husband, not a father, but a man who believed love could solve most things. And Sarah Mitchell had been the center of that belief, a woman he met in his 20s in upstate New York, bright, curious, always asking questions about the world, someone who laughed easily and dreamed loudly, and with her he felt seen in a way that made the future feel wide and possible. And they spent years building small memories that felt large at the time, late-night talks, shared coffee on quiet mornings, plans that stretched far ahead without fear, but life moved faster than their promises. And when Sarah was offered a chance to move west, to California, to follow work that excited her and scared her at the same time, Daniel hesitated, not because he loved her less, but because he wanted certainty, stability, roots, and he believed that love should fit neatly into a life, not pull it apart. And their conversations slowly turned into arguments filled with pauses and unfinished sentences, until one day they agreed to let each other go, not in anger, but in sadness, believing it was the grown-up thing to do. And Daniel told Emily how he watched Sarah leave with a smile he practiced carefully, how he promised himself that time would soften the loss, and in many ways it did, because he moved on, met Emily's mother, built a family that he cherished deeply, a life filled with responsibility, warmth, and pride. But some loves, he said quietly, do not fade completely, they settle somewhere deep and wait. And for years he barely thought of Sarah, until memories returned unexpectedly, triggered by songs, places, or moments of quiet. And then, only months before that drive with Emily, Sarah reached out, not dramatically, not with regret-filled words, but with a simple message asking how he had been all these years. And Daniel admitted that when he read it, his hands shook, not with desire to leave his life behind, but with the realization that a door he thought was closed had never fully locked. And he struggled with guilt, because he loved the life he had built. He loved being Emily's father, he respected the past he shared with her mother, yet the message stirred questions he had never allowed himself to ask. And he told Emily how he stared at his phone for days, typing responses, and deleting them, wondering if answering meant betrayal or honesty, wondering if ignoring it meant safety or fear. And as he spoke, his voice tightened, because he did not want to be a man who lived with regret, but he also did not want to be careless with the hearts around him. And Emily listened, feeling the weight of his words settle into her own chest, because she recognized the conflict, the way wanting something did not always mean acting on it. And Daniel confessed that what hurt most was not the missed chance with Sarah, but the version of himself he left behind, the man who once believed it was okay to take risks for love. And he said he did not want to be remembered only as someone who chose the safe path every time. And the lake remained still as he spoke, reflecting the sky as if holding the moment steady. And Emily realized her father was not asking for advice, not really, but for understanding, for permission to admit that his heart had a history too. And when he finished, there was silence again, not uncomfortable, but heavy with truth. And Emily reached out and placed her hand over his, grounding him in the present. And in that simple gesture, Daniel felt lighter, as if saying the words aloud had already changed something, even if no decisions had been made yet. And as they drove home that night, the story of Sarah Mitchell stayed between them, not as a threat to their family, but as proof that love does not always end cleanly, that people grow around their choices, and that some chapters remain unfinished not because they failed, but because life asked them to wait. And Daniel knew, as the road stretched ahead under the glow of headlights, that whether he answered Sarah or not, he would never again pretend that part of his heart had never existed. After that night by the lake, Emily Carter returned to her life in Toronto, but nothing felt the same, because her father's words followed her into everyday moments, into crowded trains, quiet mornings, and late evenings when the city slowed down enough for thoughts to speak clearly. And she began to notice how often people around her avoided saying what mattered, how often they chose comfort over honesty. And this awareness changed the way she looked at her own heart, especially when she met Michael Reed during a work conference in Chicago, a man from Seattle with an easy smile and calm presence, someone who listened more than he spoke and made her feel steady in a way that surprised her. And their connection grew quickly, built on long conversations, shared humor, and a gentle attraction that never rushed. But Emily kept a careful distance, not because she didn't care, but because she feared repeating her father's quiet regret, feared becoming someone who waited too long to choose or chose safety without listening to her own feelings. And as weeks passed, She found herself comparing her hesitation to Daniel's story, recognizing the same pause, the same inner debate, and it unsettled her, because she didn't want her life to be shaped by fear disguised as patience, and yet she struggled to move forward, unsure if she was protecting herself or holding herself back, and during this time, she spoke to her father more often, their conversations warmer and more honest than ever before, as if the secret they shared had opened a door between them, and one evening, after a long day filled with doubts, Emily called Daniel and told him about Michael, about her uncertainty, about the way she felt torn between wanting something real and fearing what it might cost, and Daniel listened quietly, then admitted that hearing her struggle made him reflect on his own choices, on how often he had told himself he was doing the right thing while ignoring what his heart whispered, and in that moment, Emily realized that the secret between them was no longer just about the past, it was shaping the present, guiding them both toward honesty. And with a steady voice, she told her father something she hadn't planned to say, that he was allowed to want happiness, that caring about the past did not mean disrespecting the present, and that love did not expire simply because time passed, and the silence on the other end of the line felt heavy but meaningful, until Daniel finally spoke, his voice softer, grateful, and free in a way she had never heard before, and after the call ended, Emily felt a shift inside herself, a clarity that cut through weeks of doubt, because she understood that the courage she wished for her father was the same courage she needed for herself, and days later, she agreed to visit Michael in Seattle, not with expectations of forever, but with a promise to be honest, and when she arrived, the city greeted her with gray skies and calm waters, and as they walked through quiet streets and talked about dreams and fears, Emily felt present, not guarded, allowing herself to care without trying to control the outcome, and in doing so, she felt closer to herself than she had in years, because she was no longer living in the shadow of what might go wrong, but in the light of what could be real. And back in Vermont, Daniel sat at his kitchen table staring at his phone, Sarah's message still open, and for the first time, instead of fear, he felt permission, not to rewrite the past, but to acknowledge it, and though Emily did not know what he would choose, she knew that both of them were finally moving forward, shaped by the same quiet lesson. That love, when ignored, does not disappear, but when faced honestly, can teach people how to live more fully. And as Emily looked out at the Seattle skyline one evening, feeling both vulnerable and strong, she understood that part 3 of her story was not about romance alone, but about learning to speak before silence turned into regret, and about choosing courage, even when the ending was uncertain. Time moved forward quietly after those turning moments, not with sudden changes, but with small choices that slowly reshaped everything, and Daniel Carter finally answered Sarah Mitchell's message on a calm morning, his reply simple and honest, asking how life had treated her and wishing her well, and when her response came, it carried warmth without pressure, respect without expectation, and they exchanged a few messages over weeks, careful and thoughtful, speaking about careers, health, and the roads they had taken, never crossing lines, never reopening wounds, but allowing the past to breathe without controlling the present. And through those conversations, Daniel found peace, not because something new began, but because something old was finally understood, and he realized that love did not always demand action, sometimes it only asked to be acknowledged, and as he closed that chapter gently, he felt more present with the life he had built, more grateful, more grounded, and Emily sensed the change in him even without details, hearing it in his lighter voice, his laughter, the ease in their conversations, and for her own part, Emily continued seeing Michael in Seattle, allowing the relationship to grow naturally, shaped by honesty rather than fear, and though distance tested them, they chose openness, talking about doubts before they became walls, and even when moments of uncertainty appeared, Emily faced them directly, remembering the quiet lesson her father had taught her without meaning to, that silence could protect, but it could also imprison. And one evening, as Emily walked along the waterfront alone, she reflected on how the secret between her and her father had never been about scandal or betrayal, but about trust, about seeing each other fully and still choosing care, and she understood that some stories are not meant to be shared widely, not because they are shameful, but because they are sacred. And months later, when Emily returned to Vermont for a visit, she and Daniel sat again by the same lake, the water moving gently this time, no longer perfectly still, and they spoke about life. About work, about plans, without mentioning Sarah or Michael directly, because they didn't need to. The understanding was already there, and as the sun lowered, Daniel thanked Emily for listening that night years ago, for holding space without judgment, and Emily smiled, realizing how much they had grown, not apart, but together, and as she drove away later, she felt no urge to tell the secret to anyone else, because it had done its work, shaping her values, strengthening her choices, and teaching her that love can be quiet and still powerful, that endings do not always need drama, and that understanding between two people can be one of the deepest forms of connection. And as Emily returned to her life with a steady heart and open eyes, she knew that the secret she once almost shared would remain where it belonged, not hidden in fear, but resting in gratitude, a reminder that some truths are meant to guide us, not define us, and that sometimes, the most meaningful stories are the ones held gently, between a father and a daughter, forever.